Hey everyone, welcome to this Maxon Fundamentals workshop. My name is Ellie and I'm a senior trainer here at Maxon. And throughout this series, you'll be getting up and running in Cinema 4D and Redshift and creating your own waffle scene just like this one. So whether you're a student, a beginner, or just interested in getting into 3D, then this is definitely the workshop for you. We'll be diving into the fundamentals of both Cinema 4D and Redshift, looking at navigation, modeling, animation, as well as lighting, texturing, and rendering. A few important things before we get up and running is this is actually a pre-recorded live stream, but don't worry, I'm also here in the chat with you to answer any questions that you need. Also, if you're watching the recording and you want to get in touch, feel free to ask your questions at training@maxon.net, or feel free to DM me on Instagram. I am at @itwasellie, and that's Ellie with a Y. I'll be putting together an FAQ document of all the questions that you asked throughout this entire series, as well as full access to the project files, which you can actually access and download now in the description of this video. So in this fifth and final episode of this workshop, we're going to look at animating the scene that we've created. So over the last 4 days, the last 4 episodes, we've been looking at modeling and navigation. We modeled our own scene. We built it with a few different things in the asset browser. We looked at how to create a composition, how to light it, and then how to texture it. And then we looked at how we can create that final render. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take that, we're kind of going to break it apart a little bit, and we're going to look at animation. And we're going to create this really fun, really playful animation ready for the end of this workshop. So for the final time, let's get started. Welcome back to the final part of this Maxon Fundamentals, where we're going to be looking at creating a really fun and simple animation for the waffle scene that we've just created. So this is what we're going to be looking at. We just have the box opening, the waffles kind of duplicating and popping out in a nice fun way. And then we also have this really simple camera animation pulling back. So this is how it looks inside of Cinema 4D. You've already seen the final animation. And so let's dive in back into our rendering project file scene that we looked at in episode 4 of this workshop. And this is where we're going to begin to start creating some animation. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is we don't really want to be seeing our materials because we don't really need to see them at the moment. So under options, I can actually hide my materials and then go to quick shading in my display. And now we have almost that default looking shot in our viewport. And let's just come out of our camera. So this one here, let's just come out of there. And now we can see, we can start to play around and dive into here. Okay, so to break this scene down, we have 3 things that are happening. We have the box opening. We then have the waffles appear and they duplicate and interact. And then the camera is animating backwards. So how can we set this up? Well, the first thing we actually want to do is with our waffles, we can actually delete the duplicates that we made when we made the scene. And then we can just take our original. So these were the original 3, if you remember back in the first part of this workshop, we created 3 variations of the waffles. And these are the things that we're going to duplicate using the cloner. And so what we can do with the waffles selected at the moment, they're all in slight random positions because we use that dynamic place tool to place them in a more fun way. But we actually want them to be back in the center of our scene. So a little handy trick for you is if you have these objects selected, if you press Alt or Option 0, it actually puts everything back in its 0 place for you. So we can now see we've zeroed out all of those. And let me just pull those out of this null, this waffles null, because we no longer need that now. And I'm actually just going to hide these because the first part we're going to set up is actually that box opening animation. So our little traffic light options, if I just click the top of each, we can hide those now from our render. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can set up some animation. And so the first thing we want to do is we actually want to think about how long we want our animation to be. So down the bottom here, this is what's called our timeline. And this is our animation timeline. And at the moment, we have 90 frames showing. We can increase or decrease this number just by clicking and setting a new value. And so if I type in, let's say, 150 frames, we now have a timeline that shows 0 to 150 frames. And then if we look at our project settings, which is Command or Control D, inside of our project settings, we have an FPS, and this is our frames per second. So this by default is set to 30. So what this means is for every 30 frames, that counts as 1 second of time. So because I have 150 frames, I know if I do 150 divided by 30, that makes a 5-second animation. So now I can start to think about perhaps the timing of my animation by looking at my timeline. And this is where, as we begin to add keyframes, and keyframes is where we can animate our different objects and our different things and parameters in our scenes, this is where we're going to be defining where we add those. So if I wanted to create an animation for this box, so we want to animate this box opening, what I can do, I can come over to the box, and then everything that has this little diamond option can be keyframed. The only difference in here is all of this stuff can also be keyframed. It just looks a little bit different, and that's because this is set up with Espresso. But we don't have to worry about that. All we have to know is that we can keyframe these in the same way that we can keyframe these. Okay, so if we have a look at these things, we can actually pull across these sliders, and so we can create that effect of the box opening. So what I can do, I can start with the box closed, because that's what I want to do. And then whenever I want my animation to begin, I can set that keyframe there. So we can see this, we have this little blue icon here. This represents where in my timeline we are. So we can see I'm currently on frame 34. I have my icon on frame 34. And so if I was to set a keyframe now on this top panel at this value, it will set it on this keyframe. So for me, I want to make sure this is the start of my timeline. So I'm clicking and dragging, and I'm going to set a keyframe here on my top panel at a value of 0 degrees. So let's just click that, and a few things have happened. First of all, our little button, our keyframe button has gone red, implying that we've set a keyframe. And then now just under where this little icon is, we have this little keyframe. So we've set this little keyframe here. So if I move that, we can see we have our keyframe. And the next part of this is now to decide at what point do I then want this to be completely open and at what degree. So what I'm going to do is on frame 80, so at frame 80, I want this box to be open. So I can open this to something like 195 degrees. And then I need to make sure I set another keyframe. So at the moment, this has gone yellow. And so I need to click that so it goes red. And now I can see I've got my keyframe here. And now what will happen is if I go back on my timeline, so we have loads of different play, pause, forward, back timeline buttons. This one goes to the start of my animation. Keep an eye on this box opening and keep an eye on this value. And we'll press play. And so now, really easily, we've set 2 keyframes that opens this box. Okay, the only other thing I want to animate on here is this top flap section, because I just want it to look like the top flap's opening at the same time as the main panel. So what we need to do is figure out which option this is, and this is actually this top tuck flap. So again, on frame 0, I'm going to set a keyframe here. And then on frame 30, so 1 second later, we just come out a little bit, I'm going to set this to a value of maybe, let's do 120. So we look something like this now. Set another keyframe. And then on that same keyframe as my top panel ends, at 80, we need to make sure the flap isn't intersecting, so I can pull it back down, let's say maybe 75, so it looks like it's flat on the ground, and now we can set another keyframe. So what happens is, as I scrub or click and drag through my timeline, the box opens and that top flap opens. And then that top flap starts to come back down, looking something like that. Okay. If you want to adjust or change any of these keyframes, a few things that we can do. So inside of this menu here, this little keyframe menu, this opens something called our dope sheet. And our dope sheet is where we can see all of the objects in a summary, all of the things that we have animated, including their keyframes and their values. So we can see we have our timeline at the top, we have our keyframes, and as I hover over it, we can also see the values that they've been set at. We can click to move these along. So if we want it to happen faster, so we could pull all of these keyframes in. And so now that animation happens faster. Or we could go the other way and we could have it happen slower. Let me put those back on 80. If you want to quickly change a value, you can double click. And so I could change, so this is where the top flap or the top panel is going to 195 degrees, which was this value in here. So if I wanted to change that, I can double click to change that value. Or if I go on the actual keyframe itself, I can then change this value, but I'd need to set another keyframe. You can also delete keyframes. So you can come in here and we can delete these, or we could right click and delete those. But I'm happy with how these are looking. We even have an F curve. So think of this as the interpolation of your keyframes. So if you're used to working with After Effects and you know you have a ease in and ease out or an easy ease interpolation, this is a similar workflow where we can select by pressing Command or Control A both keyframes, and then we have these little handles where we can control the interpolation as well as some simple interpolation types here. So we have this nice ease in and ease out. So what's going to happen is as my box begins to open, it's going to start slower, it's going to speed up, and then it's going to slow down again. We can swap these round. So we can create almost like a slow-mo effect here. And so this is going to be start fast, and then it's going to begin to slow down, and then it's going to speed up again. So something like that. Let's just Command or Control Z just to bring that back. Okay, so that was a little bit of an introduction on keyframing and the basics behind how we can set up some keyframes. So now let's dive into the next part of this, and that's going to be looking at creating and animating a rigid body simulation for the waffles. And again, we want to keep this nice and simple. We just want to create, let's say, around 15, 20 waffles. We want them to all appear and then interact with one another. We want them to kind of appear and bounce off each other and collide with the box. And hopefully, you know, a few of them will come out and fall on the floor like we saw in that original. Right, so how do we do that then? Well, very similar to the modeling setup with the waffle, we can actually duplicate our waffles using a cloner object. So let me just unhide these. Now we can see these in the middle of our scene. And then let's take the cloner object. So we can just click, because we already have the icon here. And if we select all of our waffles, we can just drag and drop them into the cloner. And so now what's happening is if I take a look at my cloner, we have our mode set to grid. So this is similar to what we looked at in episode 1. What we want is actually we want to have a linear mode. And in here we have a count, and then we have a position, rotation, and scale values for our clones. So if I just kind of pan out here, we can see we actually have our 3 waffles, our 3 clones here, and they are 50 centimeters apart on the y-axis. We can increase the count and we can change these values, but what we want them to do is we want them to appear in the same place, or roughly the same place. So let's maybe do 2 centimeters. And then let's just pull that into the middle. So now we can see we have our count of 3 waffles in here. And as I increase this, we can see they get made up and up and up. What we want to do is we want them to appear and duplicate over time. So this is where we can do some clever keyframing, and we can have a count of 0 at the start of my animation, and then we can go up to as many waffles as we want inside of here. So let's go to frame 0 on my timeline, and we're going to set a keyframe for the count, and the count's going to start at 0. And then at frame 90, so when the box is fully open, we're going to do a count of 15. So now as I play through, this is sort of what we've created. So it doesn't look very interesting at the moment, and my cloner actually is intersecting with the base. So if I look in here, it's actually intersecting with the base. And because we're going to be looking at simulation and dynamics, we actually don't want this to be intersecting. So if I just pull my cloner up, now we don't have any intersections going on, and this is going to work a little bit better. So how do we control these? How do we affect them and make them, affected by physics, gravity, and collide with one another and collide with the box and the backdrop or the floor? Well, on my cloner, if we right click, we have some simulation tags, and these are going to convert our normal geometry or our mesh into simulated geometry. So they'll be affected by forces, gravity, they'll collide with one another. And so it will create for a really interesting looking animation. Again, it's going to be really simple. So we have lots of different options inside of here, and you can check out the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel as well as Cineversity to learn more about all the different simulation types. But we're going to focus on rigid body today. And so this is going to convert our waffles into a rigid body object or rigid body objects. So if I press play, okay, it's looking a little bit strange. And what's happening is, as they are being made, they are actually falling through the floor. So we can see we've got a little one down here. Oh, there they go. All of those down there. And so this is because we haven't told Cinema 4D that we also have collisions or collide objects in our scene. So at the moment they're appearing, they're being affected by gravity, so they're just falling through the floor. So what we need to do is we need to set up so it collides with the box and it collides with the floor. So again, on the objects that you want it to collide with, just select them and then right click, then under simulation tags, there should be a collider. We have a few options inside of here. So we can control how they interact when they collide with each other. So whether we have bounciness, friction, or stickiness. So we don't want to have any bounce, but we do want to have quite a large amount of friction. Then we can do the same on the box. So we could actually just Command or Control, click and drag to duplicate that tag. Or we could have just right clicked and gone through that process again. Okay, so we have our collisions. Now let's try. Okay, so we're getting something happen, but it's not really looking how I'd hoped. And this is down to a few different things in our scene. So first of all, inside of our rigid body tag, we have some different options. And again, we're going to keep it simple. So we're only going to worry about our collision tab. And we have those same collision controls. So this is going to be how the waffles interact with one another. So we can again apply friction, bounciness, and stickiness. So these are what we call constraints. And it affects how the simulated objects interact and collide with one another. But we also have a thickness value. And so think of this as a protective outer layer, a collision layer. So what you might find in some cases is we have gaps when things are colliding. So with each other, they look okay, but with the box, perhaps we have too much of a gap here. And this is because the thickness is set to 1.5 centimeters, so that collision thickness has an outer layer of 1.5. Let's just set this to a little bit lower. Again, this will depend on the sizing of your objects. My waffles are 10 centimeters, so I can go to a low value. And I'm also going to increase some friction, so we prevent some sliding from occurring. Now let's press play. Okay. So it's looking a bit better, but what's happening is because in my cloner, I've got this position value, they're being created higher and higher and higher. And so it looks like they're just appearing up in space here. So let me actually just reduce that value. And now we'll create more of a popping. And that's because they're all being created in the same place. And so we get that extra little dynamic pop. Okay, so it's looking okay. I'm quite happy with this, but something I do want to do is I actually want to add some variation. So again, this has been a very key topic over this entire workshop, is looking at how we can create, variation within our modeling, variation within our texturing, so like roughness, for example, or bump. And now we want to add some additional variation to our animation. So inside, with my cloner selected, we've already taken a look at some of our effectors. So we looked at the random effector all the way back in episode 1 to create some random position movement. We can do the same thing here, but we can use it to apply some random scaling, because at the moment, the waffles are all the same size. So with my cloner selected, I'm going to take my random effector. And the important thing here is inside my cloner, to make sure it's working, inside my effectors tab, I can see that effector. Let's go to the random, and we don't actually want to do any position, but we do want to adjust some uniform scaling. So this is the size of my waffles. So we can adjust on the individual X, Y, and Z axes, or we can do it uniformly. So now we have some slight size variation. We could even do some slight positional values. And so as they appear, they're going to appear in slightly different places. Okay. So a few things that you may come across when working with this is intersections and collisions. And this is due to the accuracy and the precision of the simulation. So if you do come across these issues, Command or Control D to open your project settings. And then under simulation, we have a few different options. So inside of our scene, here is where we can control gravity and the density of the air. So we can switch off gravity if we want to, but we actually want it to be interacting in our scene. We have a time and a scene scale. So the time scale is the timing of your simulated objects. A value of 1 is its normal speed. A value of 2, it would be simulated twice the speed. Or a value of 0.5 actually works to slow down our simulation. So this would be 50% of the original speed. And I actually quite like this as an effect. I think it looks quite nice, having a slightly slower looking thing. And it also, in my opinion, prevents a little bit of jittering. We also have this scene scale option. And this is important because it's looking at the approximate sizing of the objects that are simulated in your scene. And therefore, all of our simulation settings and the constraints that we set up in our tag are using this approximate scale. But our waffles are actually 10 centimeters. So they're a little bit smaller, or quite a bit smaller than this scene scale. So to control some more accuracy and have things work in a way that we would expect them to on this size objects, we can actually just reduce that value inside of there. And you might find it slightly varies and changes how your simulation looks and this kind of stuff. Okay, so in my simulation tab, again, if you're still coming across a few issues, some things that you can control are in here. Substeps, this is important for the precision of the simulation. The higher the value, the more precise the sim will be and the collision detection will be. So if you find there are more intersections or you're having some issues, we can up these values a little bit higher to prevent any of those problems from occurring. We then have iterations and smoothing iterations. And again, this can look at preventing jitter and smoothing out our simulation. So if you find when your objects are resting, they still have a little bit of a shake or a jitter, we can incorporate some smoothing. Damping works to remove or reduce the kinetic energy. So I've heard this described before as you increase this value, it's like the simulation is happening underwater. So if I just do a very high value here, we can see what this actually is going to do. And so we can see how this quite drastically changes how this looks, adding that damping value. Let's reduce that back down. We then have some collision controls. So collision detection is really important, and we can control our collision passes, which is how often a collision detection is performed per frame. So that's what this top value is. And then we have extra iterations for additional collision detection for our existing collisions. And then an end frame pass looks at collision detection at the end of a frame. So all of these things can help improve the accuracy and the precision of your simulation. And so if you are coming across some errors and some issues, then make sure you are just adjusting a few of these values just to prevent any of those errors. Okay, so let me reduce that back down and that, because I think I was happy with how it was looking before. Okay. Something else that is important is here, at any point, we could actually come back to my cloner, and if you decide you want to have more waffles in your scene, you can come to frame 90, or we could do this in our dope sheet if we wanted to. So this is what we looked at the beginning. And we could look at our cloner and our count value, and then we can change this value in here if we want to. So maybe I could set this to a value of 18, and then let's play this through. And so we're going to have more of these waffles appear and bounce out in and around the floor. Okay. So again, remember, inside of our random, this is where we've controlled some slight position and scale options. So this means we have access to a seed value, so we can actually iterate and change that random option as well. And again, this will affect and change your simulation. So all of these things we can look at and we can control. Let's just reduce that back. Again, I think I was quite happy with how this was looking before. Okay, so you're probably thinking it looks slightly different to that original simulation. And this is because when we work with simulation and dynamics and physics inside of Cinema 4D, sometimes things can be unpredictable, and we won't get the exact same result every single time. So even if I match the same settings that I got previously, we may not match and get the exact same result. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, so we've created our simulation, and just to recap, what we did was we took our individual waffles and we cloned them or duplicated them in a cloner. We then animated that count value. So we have this popping simulation, and then we turned them into dynamics or rigid body objects by applying that rigid body tag. We then set up our collider objects so they didn't fall through the floor. And then we took a little look at some of our scene and simulation settings to look at fixing any collisions or intersections or any errors. Now what we can do is we can look to set up the third part of this animation, which would be our camera settings or our camera animation. So what we can do, let me just actually put these into my scene just so they're nice and neat, and then we can just scroll that up. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to animate a second camera. So this was my original. This was kind of my still frame camera that we set up in the last episode. And we set that up in the in the second episode, looking at light and composition, and then we obviously rendered out that still in the last episode. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just copy and paste this, and I'm going to rename this Anim for animation. So this is my animated camera. And I'm actually going to put it back into the center. So I'm going to zero out our position and rotation, which I can do inside my coordinates manager, or I can just press Option or Alt and 0. And we can see that zeroed out. And let's just hide those for now. And so we have this camera in our scene. Let me just hide this other one because we don't need to see that. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up some really simple camera movement, and we're going to use a spline, which is like a path, to control the path or the movement that camera follows. So inside of this menu, we have some splines. So if I click and hold, we have a few different options which we can use as a path. I'm going to take the arc, but we could also even just draw our own spline using the spline pen. So with this arc, let me just scale this down, and let's just rotate this because I want this movement to occur a little bit like this. So it's going to be a nice, simple sort of pan or zoom out. So with the arc selected, I'm just going to rotate it. So I'm going to press the R key, and I'm going to rotate it on the green axis at first. So I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm clicking and dragging, and you'll see that we're moving or rotating in degrees of 5. And then maybe just this blue handle, something like 85. Okay, and now let me just reposition this so we can take our move tool, and you'll notice my gizmo is actually, it's not a perfect 90 degrees to my floor. And this is because it's looking at the axis rotation of my arc. And so if I move this back and forth, you'll see it actually is going slightly up and down as well. So what I can do, I can change it so it actually looks at the world coordinates as opposed to the objects. So if I do world, I can then pull it back. And now it looks, and it's going in line with the base. Let me just rotate that up and then pull that back. Okay, now what I want to do is I actually want to place the camera on my spline, so on this path. So let's name this camera movement, just so we're keeping everything organized so we know exactly what everything is doing. So I want to put this camera onto my arc or onto my spline, and then I want to control its position on there. And that's what we're going to do to animate. So again, we're going to look at Cinema 4D's tags. So on my Redshift camera, I'm going to right click, and under animation, we have something called align to spline. And then inside my tag, it's asking for a path. So that is the spline that we just created, our camera movement. So I'm going to drag and drop that into here, and you'll see that the camera now snaps to the starting position of that spline. And what's really great is now I have this position option, and I can control the position of my camera. So here we're able to create some really simple animation. But what you'll notice is the camera is actually always facing on this Z direction, on this Z axis. But we actually want it to always be facing our scene, our box of waffles. And so we've already looked at the target tag when we looked at lighting, and we can do the exact same technique here. So again, on my Redshift camera, I can right click, and under animation tags, we can apply that target tag. And then what we need to do is we need to remember target something. So we could target the object, but what I like to do is I like to use a null And this is going to be our camera target. And I'm going to place that null inside my target here. And I'm just going to reposition this something like that. And if we pan out, you'll see that my camera is now facing this target, which means as I now control the align to spline position, we're always going to get that. Okay, so now let's take a little look inside of my camera. So this is where I want to start. We can see we are very, very much too close to my scene. We can't see anything. We can only really see the front of that box. So in my 4 views, so again, we just clicked this minimize, maximize window. We can actually use our different views to reposition that camera movement. So what we have to move is the spline, because remember, everything else is connected to it. So if I just move this out, maybe we could scale it up slightly and again, move it back, just so we get something that we're happy with. Maybe a little bit further back. And actually what I might do, I might make it a little bit longer. So I'm going to make my spline, my arc spline, a little bit longer, so just slightly. We have something like this. Let's maybe go. Let's adjust my camera target a little bit. And now, as we animate this, this is what we're creating. So perhaps a little bit more. Let's actually just rotate this slightly. Let me just rotate this. Something like that. And then it's a case of just keyframing this option here. So what we can do is I actually want the start of my animation to be at the end of my spline. So at 100% position. And then at the end of my animation, I want it to be set to 120. So on frames 120, I want it to be on a position of 0. And then what we have is we have this happening. Okay. So a couple of final things I want to talk about. And that first one is going to be our simulation at the moment is having to run every single time we restart our timeline. And so what we can do, if we're happy with how our simulation looks, our rigid body simulation, we can actually do something that's called caching it or baking it down. And what that means is we'll no longer be able to make changes unless we clear the cache. But what it does is it actually allows things to work faster and better in our scene. And then we can scrub through our timeline and see that animation. So the way that we do that is under our tag, we can go to the cache option. And all we have to do is we just have to click to cache the scene. And so we're just going to let this go through. I'm going to let this cache. And then once that's done, we'll then be able to have this and then scrub through our scene and we'll have it set up as our final animation. So now if I scrub through, we can see we have that. So I'm not very happy with this, but I mean, I could go back and make these changes, but just for the sake of the workshop, that I'm actually not going to worry about doing that. But if you do then decide you want to come back and make changes to your animation or your simulation, all you have to do is clear that cache and then reset that up and then recache that simulation if you want to. Okay. So we're almost there, but there's something I do actually want to talk about, and this is actually back on the texturing topic. So if I go into my Redshift render view, and I'll just dock that inside of here, let's just take a little look in my Redshift camera. So as this animates, what you might notice is the texture is actually moving. So if I just do this slowly, keep an eye on these spots or these circles here. As I move through, it's as if the texture is actually in place or in kind of like in the space, and the object is moving through it. Therefore, we get a change in this noise. And so if we want to fix this, if you've followed this method and you're using max on noises, I'm going to show you a quick way of how we can fix that. So inside of my materials, this is happening inside of the cardboard here. I'm just going to double click to open that up. And the issue here is this max on noise. So this is what we're using to blend between our materials. And it looks something like this. So we'll be able to see this now, this moving. Okay. And we don't really want that. The way that we can fix it is if we come down into our input, at the moment, the source for this input is set to object. If we set it to UV or vertex attribute, and then we can just refresh that, you'll notice that it changes how it looks entirely. But what we do have is we now have it sticking to the surface of our object. We don't have that movement. So all we need to do is we can then play around with our scaling to then bring back a look that we're happy with. Maybe 1.5 could be a nice one. And let's unsolo it. And now we don't get that additional movement. So now as we come through and we play it through, you'll see it actually sticks to the surface of my object here. Okay, one final thing is now, how do we want to render this actual animation out? So in the last episode, we looked at how we can render a still inside of our render settings. So we looked at our output as well as our Redshift render settings. But what we want to do if we're rendering out an animation, under output, we have this frame range option. At the moment, it's set to current frame. So when we set this to render, we're just going to be rendering out the current frame, which is currently frame 5. In order to render out an animation, is we want to render out all of our frames or some of our frames in our timeline. So if we set this to manual, we can control which section of our timeline we want to render. So if we only wanted to render 90 frames, we could do 0 to 90, or we could do 30 to 120, and we'll just be rendering out that particular section. Or if we want to render our entire animation and our entire timeline, we just set this to all frames, and you'll notice that automatically it sets that from and to frame range for us. So that's the first step. The next step is to go into your save path, make sure you apply a file path here, and then choose your format. We have 2 animation formats, MOV and MP4, but I would recommend rendering out an image sequence. And this is because, as we know, software and technology can sometimes be unpredictable. If you are rendering out an MOV or an MP4 and it crashes partway through, or something happens and we get some issues partway through, we lose all of the data that we've already rendered. But if we render out an image sequence, for example, a PNG sequence, we will get an image per frame, and all we need to do is composite that together, in software like After Effects. And so if at frame 90, we have some issues or it crashes or there's some artifacts on a particular frame, I don't lose all of that time and that data. I can keep that information and just render out the remaining or the frames that have issues. And then, as I said, we can just put that into something like After Effects, apply some, fun color grading effects or some extra effects using Red Giant, for example, and create that final animation and export that then as your MP4 and as your MOV. So we've come to the end of this Max on Fundamentals workshop. I hope you've enjoyed this series and have been able to dive more into learning Cinema 4D and Redshift. To recap, throughout these 5 episodes, we've looked at getting started in Cinema 4D, learning how to navigate and create objects like our waffles. We then looked at lighting and composition and how we can begin to create our own textures inside of Redshift. And finally, over these last 2 parts, we started looking at rendering and a little bit of animation. Good luck with your 3D journeys, and don't forget you can continue to get in touch with us at training@maxon.net. Or feel free to DM me on Instagram, I'm @itwasellie. If you'd like to learn more about our tools, not just Cinema 4D and Redshift, but also ZBrush, Red Giant and Forger, then check out the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel or cineversity.com. Thanks for taking part in this workshop, and I'll see you on our live stream soon. Bye everyone.